everyone. So welcome to our latest version of TRC University. Are you recording, Anna? Yep. Yeah, I think I can see the little record thing there. All right, so I'm Simon Moss, COO of the recruitment company. Welcome to anyone that hasn't been to TRC University before. Essentially, what we try and do here is a really sort of quick snapshot of some interesting sort of academic topics that really just sort of scratch the surface of fairly big topics. And the idea is they, spark an interest. People like to go off and read more about stuff, or people just like a bit of a sort of surface level intro to different topics. So today we're talking about bias, heuristics, and diversity. Now, I'm joined by my co-presenter, Teresa Romanovski. Teresa is long-term friend of TRC and is the founder of Careers for Purpose. And I apologise if I get this wrong, Teresa, but it's a recruitment company focused on recruitment within sustainable and ethical industries and career paths. Teresa specialises in, I think, aligning candidates with career paths more in line with their own sort of ethical values, and in recruiting for companies looking for candidates that share their ethical, sustainable values. Is that a ham-fisted description of your company, Teresa? Yeah.
So I connect mission-driven employers with values-driven employees.
Yes, much better. Brilliant. All right. So before I start today, I want to ask everyone a question. All right. So don't overthink answers, or you're really looking for your first answer. So don't need to call it out or anything. You just note it down, and we'll come back to this question a little bit later on today. So here's a question for you. So a bit of a riddle. A father and son are in a car crash and are rushed to the hospital. The father dies. The boy is taken to the operating room, and the surgeon says, "I can't operate on this boy because he is my son." How is this possible? Okay, so have a just note down your first sort of thoughts on that one, and we'll come back to that question a little bit later on. Okay, so today we're going to do, I'm going to do the first section, which is basically a very academic look at bias and heuristics and what they are. We'll look at some common heuristic tools that our brain utilizes and some common biases that emanate from them. Teresa then to look at why is diversity important, what bias impacts us in business decisions, and how we can overcome our own bias and our own sort of shortcuts we put in place in decision making. So first of all, what do we mean by heuristics and bias? So heuristics are mental shortcuts or processes that we use to make decisions. Generally speaking, heuristics describe the process of finding a sort of convenient or good enough, but not always optimal solution to a problem. So in decision making, heuristics, the study of heuristics describes the psychology of mental shortcuts that we've evolved to make rapid decisions. So if every decision you make a rational decision, then you're going to be thinking about it forever or far too long to really make an effective decision. So quite often we need to make decisions that are good enough but not optimal in order to survive. So early Homo sapiens, there's early Homo sapiens that made complete rational decisions that stood around considering all the options and all the data when a saber-toothed tiger was charging towards them. That early Homo sapien did not get to pass on his genes to the next generation. He was gone. So early Homo sapiens who were able to quickly make mental shortcuts and make decisions without all the information, and therefore it looks very similar to the saber-toothed tiger that ate my mate Steve last week. I'm going to run away. That's a mental heuristic. They made a decision, they run away, they live to pass on their genes to the next generation. So heuristics are something we've evolved to survive. And the study of heuristics is a study of these sort of shortcuts that evolve within our brain, the study of how we make decisions and what influences those decisions. And bias can be essentially the sort of day-to-day assumptions that we make based on those heuristic shortcuts in our brain. So I'll give you some examples of how our brain sort of skips things. So if you look at these two tables here, now you're looking at that and you're thinking the one on the left, I assume your left and right is the same for you on this. The one on the left is longer and thinner, and the one on the right is shorter and squatter. And your brain's looking at those two tables, and it's processing the information, and it presents that to you. And although you know it's probably an optical illusion, and you're trying to sort of get your brain to see the optical illusion, your brain is fairly confident that what it's seeing is what it's telling you is what you're actually seeing. In reality, those two tables are actually exactly the same inside the tabletops. So your brain is processing the data and is making decisions for you based on perfect information. Another example used to describe heuristics is it's around about context. Your brain adds context to what it's seeing and what it's processing. So if you read this diagram across, you should read A, B, C. If you read this diagram down, you read 12, 13, 14. And depending on which way you're looking at it, your brain is very convinced that that center digit is either a B or a 13. It isn't. It is actually both. Your brain is right in both instances, but the process of your brain convincing you that it is one or the other, depending on which context of which we're reading it, that's a mental heuristic. So when we study decision making, there's a few sort of core ones. That there's loads of different heuristics or mental shortcuts that have been discovered and studied and researched, etc. But three of the main ones that I'll talk about today, these three here. And these are three different ways that our brains process information and drive decisions. So the first of these is the availability heuristic. And essentially, we make decisions based on information that is easy and quick to retrieve. So this means that our brains put emphasis and credibility on information that is dominant in our minds at the time. So it draws up information that is recent, that is dominant, is strong, that is emotional, information that's easy for us to retrieve. We get that information and we make decisions on that. We put a lot of weight on that information. So it's great for quick decision making. It's great for learning from experience, from learning from dramatic or traumatic events. It's how human races survive, as we learn and we adapt. But it can mean that we overestimate the likelihood of events where there is an example that is more readily available to us. So, or that it's easier to bring to mind. So humans tend to believe that things are more likely if they're more readily available to pop into your head. So, we think it's more likely to be attacked by a shark, for instance, than it is to die from the flu, when statistically it's much more likely we die from the flu than we would be eaten by a shark. But because the shark example is easier to bring to mind, we put more emphasis on it. We consider it to be more likely than it actually is. So the availability heuristic is essential shortcut when you're faced with saber-toothed tigers, etc., because you draw that information quickly to mind and make a decision to run. But when you're making rational business decisions, it's a shortcut that can lead to putting overemphasis on information that is maybe not the most rational information to be using. A second heuristic that's very common in business decision making is a representative heuristic. And essentially, when making decisions under uncertainty, people tend to make a decision by prototypes that they hold in their head. So we all have built prototypes or stereotypes in our brain, into which when we meet people or we enter situations or we look at data or we to make a decision, we tend to slot that into a pre-existing group prototype in our brain. And even when that goes against statistical logic, it influences our decision. So this is a great mental mechanism for, again, learning from past experiences, from being able to say, okay, this looks similar to this previous time I did this, or this person I met before where this occurred, this person seems to be very similar to them, and you can make decisions. It's great for those sorts of decisions, but it can lead to irrational decision making. When you think it's like something else, you then tend to close off the possibility that it's different. So great way to avoid danger quickly, but probably the one that leads most significantly to bias, stereotyping, and closing yourself off from new experiences and people. And the last of the three heuristics I want to sort of fire through is the effect heuristic. So effect heuristic is that we tend to make decisions based on our emotional response to information rather than a rational analysis of that information. So if something, we're faced with a decision that evokes an emotional response, that will cloud our ability to process the information. So for instance, if you have a manager who meets someone in an interview scenario who reminds her of an ex-husband that she's not particularly fond of anymore, then her decisions about that person will be very different to if she meets someone who reminds her of a friend she has very fond memories of. The two emotions that those two different people will evoke in that manager will lead her to make different decisions, regardless of how rational that is. There's a subset of the effect heuristic, which is called the outrage heuristic, which is basically that if we're presented with a scenario that outrages us, that causes anger rather than just sort of a standard emotional response, but outrage, then it will significantly impair our ability to logically and rationally assess data that has been presented to us. We make decisions based on outrage rather than on a rational assessment of the actual impact of the thing that we're assessing. So there's three examples of heuristics. There's books and books written on all different sorts of them, but these three heuristics are powerful tools that our brain uses. They're critical for us to survive, but they lead to a number of biases, which we'll talk about in a second. So around those heuristics, there's also this thing called bounded rationality. Bounded rationality or bounded awareness is the fact that in order to make a decision, we need to make that limited information with an imperfect amount of data. So if you were hiring someone for your company, you wanted to hire the best possible person for your company, then you would essentially need to meet or interview or assess pretty much everyone on the planet. Obviously, that's going to take you about 3,000 years to do. It isn't a very useful process. But what we need to do then is we need to have bounded rationality. We need to pick a very small subset of that population and assess that to find the best person we can from within that group. So although we know that isn't perfect data, we're not the best person for a company could be outside of that tiny group of people. We're aware that the time savings of that outweigh the fact that we may miss out on the best person. We will get close enough. We'll get someone who's close enough to being the best person for a company. And that's every decision we make. If we were to assess all the information we need to make a completely rational decision, we would never make any decisions. We'd be stood in that donut shop forever, weighing up which flavour donut we're going to get because we're processing all the information. So we live in a world where we every decision we make is within bounded rationality. And the way they describe it is that we make decisions that suffice. So they suffice and they satisfy the criteria we set out, but they're imperfect. And it's in business decision making, or study of decision making, they call it a decision that satisfies the criteria. And what it does, it allows us to cope with information overload as we and more and more information is presented to us. Constant information overload that we've always had as humans, but more so now than ever. We're able to make decisions with this bounded rationality. But what it does do is it can lead to us ignoring useful information. Our brain says, okay, look, this is the data we're going to assess. This is all the data I can focus on. And like a sort of Facebook algorithm, it presents data to us that it thinks is useful in making that decision. But obviously that can lead to significant bias in that it chooses also which information to ignore. So if you consider that there are all these heuristics in your brain making shortcuts, plus this part of your brain that is culling the data that you're using to make this information, that's where bias comes from. And bias is sort of the dark side of heuristics. It's when heuristic mechanisms that are useful tools start hindering our decision making. They start cutting out information that our brain is presenting to us that allows us to make optimal or decisions that satisfies, and it starts making suboptimal decisions, cutting us off from new ideas. Really sort of the negative side of heuristics. So a couple of common biases that we will find in how we run. So I'll do a bit of an exercise really quickly. So I'm going to, conscious of time, so I'm going to charge you this one, but I want everyone to think of the last 3 numbers of your phone number. Okay. If you've got a bit of paper or pen in front of you, write it down. Otherwise, keep it in your head. And I want to put a 1 in front of those numbers. So you should have a 4-digit number. So the last 3 numbers of your mobile phone number, put a 1 in front of it, and you should have a 4-digit number. Now that number looks like a year. What I want you to do is I want you to look at that number and think, do you think that year that those 4 numbers have presented to you, was the Taj Mahal built, was it completed, being built before or after that year you've written down there? So do you believe the Taj Mahal was built before or after that year? And then what I want you to do is just really quickly is to write down in the notes section or the chat function here, and I'll have a look at it in a second. First of all, write down the 4-digit year that you got from your phone number. And then after that, immediately after that, write the year that you believe the Taj Mahal was built, or the building was completed for Taj Mahal. So if everyone could just quickly do that, that'd be awesome. We'll do a little experiment, see if it works. I can't see anyone, so I'm hoping everyone's doing that. All right, so if everyone's done that, what we have essentially is there's a thing called an anchoring bias. And what our brain does is when we're forced to estimate something that we're unsure of, we're anchored by anything that's previously been mentioned. So if we're given a low value, as an example, if I said, oh, there's 23, guess the number of jelly beans in a jar, just give me any number, say 23. On average, then the responses would be lower than if I said, estimate how many jelly beans in that jar, give me a single number, say 15,000. The estimates there would be higher. So what our brain does is regardless of the irrelevance of the anchor, whatever number is mentioned anchors us and influences our estimate. So it's a tool that salespeople use all the time. If they want you to be estimating the value of something, they will mention higher. If they want you to estimate value of something you want to sell, they'll be anchoring it lower. But it's just a shortcut your brain uses when in uncertainty, it anchors to any number it can find. Obviously, your phone number has 0 relevance to when the year the Taj Mahal was built, but I'm hoping that our experiment will work. And I'll look at those numbers in a second. People with lower phone numbers will have lower estimates on years, and higher phone numbers will have higher estimate on years. So we'll see if that works. But that's a very common bias in how we think. Okay, I'm going to ask a question here just to think. So Linda is 31 years old. I'll talk about Linda. So Linda is 31 years old. She's single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Which of these is more probable? A, Linda is a bank teller, or B, Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. So have a think, which of those do you think is more probable? A, Linda, who those things at uni. So A, Linda is a bank teller, or B, Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. So I don't need to just send any response or anything, but if your answer to that was B, most people respond to that with B is the most likely. It does sound that that's potentially what Linda would be. But what this is called the conjunction fallacy, and this is a way that our brain makes decisions. It's actually impossible for B to be more likely than A, but probably about 90% of people will answer B to that question. And why it's impossible is that it's essentially like saying what's more likely, Linda has a red car or Linda has a car. B is a subset of A. So it's just logically and rationally, it's impossible for B to be more likely. But because you make the emotional connection with Linda and she starts fitting into stereotypes and prototypes in our brain, and we start picturing her, we start slotting her into things, we assume that that option B is more likely than option A, even though it's impossible because B is a subset of A. It's not more likely that she's a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement than it is that she's just a bank teller. So that's called the conjunction fallacy. It's a way our brain ignores rational probability and makes decisions and puts more emphasis on certain scenarios than others. Have a confirmation bias. So this is one that you would have all seen a lot over the last few years of very divisive topics out there, particularly presented on social media. That people, we all do it, is that we put more weight on information and data that supports our viewpoint. And we put less weight on information, or easier to dismiss information and data that goes against our viewpoint. We all do it. It's constantly. If you something that supports a belief you have, you will be more likely to believe it than or put emphasis on it and credibility on it than if it goes against your viewpoint. So that's called a confirmation bias, and we constantly look for, seek out, and put credibility on information that supports a pre-existing opinion. And that's a very common bias, and one that social media plays on very, very well in terms of their algorithms. And we also have observational selection bias. This is the way we notice things when on our radar. So if something is front of mind, you will notice it a lot. And this is a lot where our sense of coincidence comes from. So if you're talking about something or you think about something, all of a sudden you see it everywhere. So if you buy, the really common example is you buy a new car and all of a sudden you see people with that car. When I bought my Citroen, I suddenly saw the 6 other people in Sydney with a Citroen, and you think, wow, everyone's suddenly buying this car. They're not. They've always been there. You just haven't noticed them because your brain can only visually, or you only take in certain bits of information. Your brain selects which information it's going to process. When something's front of mind, it starts to process that. So this is where a lot of things we say, wow, what a coincidence. I was just talking about that yesterday. And there is, and so when you see adverts on social media about something you had a conversation about the day before, personally, I'm still not sure whether it does listen to you and present those adverts to you, but quite often the fact that you see an advert about something you talked about isn't because it's listening to you, it's because they're always there, you just didn't notice them to the front of mind. And our brain has an observational selection bias that presents information to us that's front of mind. You have the affinity bias, and basically this is the bias whereby we are naturally drawn towards things that are like us. So we see things, people that remind us of us, situations that remind us of situations we've been in, we're drawn naturally towards those things. It's easier to communicate and get along with people or things that are similar to us and reminds of us, rather than it's harder to communicate with people who are more diverse from us. A common bias is representation bias, which is that we have group people and things into categories, pre-existing categories. This can lead to obviously stereotypes, etc. Very dangerous bias. We meet people, well, rather than assessing them as individuals or new individuals, we tend to group them with pre-existing people we've met before. There's a whole ton of other common biases that we use on a day-to-day basis. But I'm going to pass over to Teresa because I think I've overrun a little bit on my time. But basically, heuristics are essential to decision making. Everyone uses them. Everyone has bias. Everyone has heuristics. Powerful mental tools, but they can lead to bias, which can be very dangerous. So there you go. That's that sort of academic side of it. Pass over to Teresa.
Right.
Sorry, Teresa, did you overrun a bit?
I'll talk quickly. Oh, bear with me a second. Get my presentation up. On. Sorry. There's my Teams.
Looking through the numbers for the Taj Mahal, I think we disproved the theory.
Okay. Oh, where's my little? What screen can you guys see? Can you see the the presented version or the?
No, I can just see the one slide.
Okay, good. All right. Cool. All right. Thank you, Simon. It's really interesting, I think, how our brains work in this respect, and we shouldn't beat ourselves up about how we think either, because it is, as Simon has said, it's it's born from a deep rooted into our DNA, and it's about recognizing these biases so that we can counteract them and catch ourselves when we're doing it or others are doing it, and look at ways of trying to remove that from certain processes. We know as recruiters or hiring managers, some of the key biases that sort of creep into our work is usually around things like gender, age and ethnicity. They're sort of three of the common things that tend to come into the hiring process. Obviously, there are other biases as well that can come into the hiring process. It's probably the most common, though, would be those three. So this is where we need to, look at, I'm going to look probably a little bit more heavily on, say, gender, because obviously that's a big topic and something that's really talked about extensively these days as well, around equality in the workplace. For both sides, obviously it's a focus on women and equality for women, but also men get disadvantaged in the workplace for certain aspects too, and I'll cover a couple of those things. Looking at, back in 1968, a gentleman called Philip Goldberg conducted a randomized experiment to demonstrate how unconscious gender bias was triggered by the assignment of a male called John T. McKay and a female called Joan T. McKay as the author of an essay, led evaluators to rate identical work differently based on whether they thought it was written by a man or a woman. So this was subsequently termed the Goldberg design, and it's been used extensively to document the existence of gender biases and the evaluation of men and women and their work, and also to test the effectiveness of interventions to reduce that. Another study carried out by the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, they conducted a systematic review of all the studies that used the Goldberg design to assess gender bias in experimental sort of hiring settings. And taken together, those studies document that both male and female evaluators, generally to the same degree, rate women applicants as being less competent, less hireable, deserving of a lower salary than the identical credentials of a man, and particularly when men and women are applying for high status or leadership positions. So men and women rated women lower on all those aspects. So it's not a feminist kind of, women are giving the vote to all the women. We're just as bad to our own gender as what men can be. So obviously this is deep rooted in culture and society and how we're brought up. And obviously periods of time as well. We're becoming much more aware of it today than perhaps we were, many years ago when these sorts of studies were done. And that's not changed over 30 years, though, really. I think we're becoming more aware of it, but our automatic default position is to perhaps think that way because, it's just how we are conditioned from a cultural perspective. And this was given particular attention in things like the STEM industries, so the science, technology, engineering, maths industries, where often, and other industries as well, but that's a particular industry where women are more, less likely to be selected into things like graduate programs. They receive lower salaries. They're less likely to be promoted. And less likely to receive, comparable levels of praise compared to their male counterparts, and less also likely to be elevated to executive positions. And that last aspect is certainly common across all sorts of industries. As we know, there's far fewer women sitting as CEOs or sitting on boards than there should be. And there are lots of companies that are making improvements to that. So the examples studied of gender bias occur sort of in spite of other evidence that collective intelligence of teams is greater when women are part of, sitting around that table. And women are as effective as men in leadership roles, and possibly more likely to be effective in a transformation and demonstrating a transformational sort of effect, and bring different leadership styles to the table. So we know that happens. We know having a gender diverse workforce is much more beneficial to everybody. But of course, this conditioning doesn't help us. Gender is not obviously the only one, as I say. There's age biases as well. We know as an aging population, we get a lot more older people, and we're going to continue to see a lot more older people, potentially in their late 50s and 60s, and beyond, going to be looking for work at some point. As we all get older and live for longer and need to work longer. Not a prospect I'm looking forward to, but the reality of what it will be. I suppose the offset is, if we've got better medical outcomes, we can live for longer and enjoy life. But, we're going to have to start waking up to the fact that older people can bring a whole new dynamic to our workforce. And then, of course, ethnicities as well. Why choose one ethnicity over another, making, again, those biases, those assumptions that if you're from a certain background, then you must behave in a certain way, or you're not as good at doing a particular thing. And you may behave in a slightly different way because your cultural upbringing would be different, but that doesn't mean to say that you can't then bring that as a positive to a diverse workforce. Of course, there's lots of other biases as well, as I mentioned before. Disabilities, making an assumption that, oh, well, we can't have somebody in a wheelchair because, maybe we don't have, we're not thinking about all the facilities that they might need, or making assumptions that they're going to need a lot more help than what an able-bodied person may need, without actually finding out, well, what do they need from us? The LGBTQI plus communities as well, as that becomes more open, and we come, as certainly as a developed country, becoming more open to accepting different genders and different persuasions. There's still those inherent biases that will come perhaps into the workforce, where perhaps we don't want a gay person in our team for, we might think they won't fit in. So those biases still obviously exist. There's things like physical attractiveness. This is a bias. There's studies around people that are more physically attractive get better jobs, more promotions, higher rates of pay. And equally, as you see on this slide, the height graphic. The taller you are, if you're a tall male, you're more likely to be a powerful CEO in a big corporation. So, which just seems bizarre, but that's where it all comes from. But men can also be disadvantaged in a lot of this as well. If a man demonstrates that they are more, driven by equality and fairness, they can be deemed as perhaps, being softer or less masculine, and therefore may miss out on a certain promotion. And I think, that's certainly in past decades, when men in the workplace were meant to be strong leaders and very decisive and, not afraid of conflict and things like that. And it's like, well, men have a softer side too. We all have both of those aspects in our personalities. So, men can be disadvantaged with that as well. And there was another study where they looked at gaps in CVs and unexplained gaps. And women that had an unexplained gap were more likely to get an interview because it was just assumed that that woman had time off to have a family. Rightly or wrongly assumed. Whereas with a man, if it was an unexplained gap, it was deemed as, well, what happened? Why were you the breadwinner? Why were you not working? So it was looked upon negatively for those reasons, even though he may well have been the one raising the family. So those biases, are still very prevalent today. And I think with a lot more movement towards equality in parenting, we'll see in the coming decades, hopefully, that start to dissipate as well. So how does it affect the workplace? Well, there's some really interesting studies, and you can Google this to the nth degree. There's heaps out there, but basically there's a lot of money being lost by not having diversity and inclusion in your workplace. And when I say diversity and inclusion, we kind of sort of think of them as one thing, but they're not. So diversity is having a diverse workforce, so different genders, different persuasions, different age groups, different ethnicities, disabilities, etc., etc., socioeconomic backgrounds, etc. And then inclusion is, how do you include those people in that workplace? So it's all very well saying, oh yes, we've got older people here, and we've got people from different ethnic backgrounds here. But then if you exclude them from certain workplace activities that doesn't suit perhaps their religious beliefs, or they can't participate because perhaps they're older or they have a disability, then you're not being inclusive. So inclusive, really, you've got to make sure that that inclusive part is really the next key element of having a diverse workforce. You can't have one and then say you've got the other. So they're very much interlinked. But you can see on these graphs here, so Boston Consulting Group did a study and comparing, the leadership teams around, revenues. So 19% higher revenues in companies were more diverse management. So that's quite a significant, figure. It's nearly a quarter. Had high revenues. That's money being left on the table for a company that's not embracing that, and that's really significant, particularly for tech companies and startups, where innovation is that key to growth. So if you're not bringing in diverse talent, you're really missing out on where you can build your product and grow it in a market that's obviously very fast paced and highly moving. So it's really integral to that revenue generation in a business. Just conscious of time, I can't see the clock. I did. Okay, so yeah, diversity and inclusion, important factor in millennials as well. So Institute for Public Relations and the Weber Shanwick survey, millennials are much more comfortable talking about diversity and inclusion. It's much more natural to them. They've been brought up in a bit more of a society that embraces that. So, and they're more likely to consider diversity and inclusion when accepting a new job. So if you're hiring somebody and you don't have that as a philosophy in your business, you may put those millennials off. And they'll go choose somewhere else. It's becoming much more, in my business, becoming much more, that's why I set it up, for people looking for more meaning in the companies that they join. And a Deloitte survey said 74% of individuals believe that organizations are more innovative when their culture is inclusive, which obviously goes back to that previous slide with tech companies and startups utilizing that diversity to launch and improve their product. And this other study by McKinsey & Company said when you look at the full potential scenario in women's participation identical to men globally, if it was full participation, that's $28 trillion lost in GDP. They predict will be lost in GDP by 2025. So this was done in 2015. So obviously pre-pandemic, so I don't know how that study would look today. But if the pandemic kind of happened, that was their prediction. Be interesting to see what, perhaps if they redo this study for later on. But that's a whole heap of money being left on the table there. And even if best case scenario, if every country was just as good as its better neighbor, that's still $12 trillion being left on the table by not including women. That's just not including women, let alone all the other diverse aspects. So I'm just a bit conscious of time. As you can see, I'm speeding up my voice. So I just want to quickly run through the tools that we can use to mitigate some of these aspects from our hiring process, because obviously that's kind of the part of the point of this. So there's a few different tools. One of the things sort of quite early on you can do, well, one of the first things is have a good diversity and inclusion policy and actually live and breathe by it, because that's going to attract candidates in the first place. But when you're actually running your adverts, there are different tools that you can use to take gendered words out of your advertising. So there is I can send it around if anyone wants it, but you can Google it. I can't remember the name of the, if you just Google gendered advertising or gendered ad, something, yeah, anyway, it'll come up. It's one of the first ones that come up. And you basically, it's a free tool. You just copy and paste your advert, stick it in there and run it, and it will pull out all the masculine words or more masculine words, and pull out all the more feminine words. And it will then give you a weighting as to whether your advert reads more masculine or more feminine or is balanced. And so when we say masculine, it's things like dynamic, strong, effective. Actually, I think effective might be more feminine, but yeah, feminine is more, supportive, teamwork, leadership, mentoring, those sorts of words that are a bit more inclusive rather than so sort of blunt. So it's a really good way of just, before you put up any ad, just run it through that free tool just to test that out. Once you've got your adverts in, of course, your applicants coming through, there are other tools you can use for blind applications. So there are technologies that you can employ to do that. So software that you can use that will do that for you, or you might have an applicant tracking system that enables you to configure it to do that, or you might use an outsourced person that literally, you know, just takes off all the, so it's basically taking off all the anything that can identify that person's age, gender, ethnicity, possibly you know, their geography, where they live, which might indicate their socioeconomic background. So they can remove all of that, or the software can remove all of that. So all you're looking at is their skills, perhaps their education, but maybe not necessarily where they were educated, because again, that can be used in bias, and obviously their work history. So that it's taken away a lot of those aspects. So it sort of forces you to just look at you know, the key criteria as to whether they match the role that you have. So as I say, there is technology you can do to, you know, to use that if you have the budget for it, but there are ways around that if you don't want to do that. Even just somebody in your team literally just stripping all that information out and then sending you the copies. What I would then strongly recommend is structured interviews. So I know it's nice to do fairly informal interviews. I know as a recruiter, and you know, us recruiters, we're you know, interviewing all the time. So it's nice to do something quite informal and put somebody at ease, and get to know them and get them to open up a little bit. But the issue with that sometimes is that definitely those biases creep in. Because as you know, Simon went through earlier, things like affinity biases and confirmation biases, where, you know, is this person like me or not like me? You know, do they like the same sporting teams as me, or do they follow a team that I hate? And so I'm now going to form an opinion about that person. You know, and that's where having that bit more relaxed environment can sort of, those things can creep in really, really easily. We can fall prey to that. So a structured interview, at least for that first interview, you can obviously ask questions around getting to know someone and what perhaps their hobbies and interests are. But really having a structured interview, that interview is exactly the same interview for every single person. So you don't deviate from that and ask different questions to different people. It's got to be the same for every single one. And then in addition to that, have others in that process, and that keeps you on track as well. So a panel interview, but that can be obviously a little bit time consuming if you're trying to get, you know, 3 or 4 people to attend every single interview. But it doesn't have to be 3 or 4. It can just be one other person. I think it's always good to interview with one other person at least, whether that be a HR person if you're the hiring manager, or another member of the team, or the person, or even a person from another department, which is always recommended as well. So bring other people in from different departments that represent different groups in your organisation. One, that will demonstrate to your potential hire that you're a diverse workplace and you value the opinions of others. But 2, you'll get different takes on feedback from those interviews. So someone older interviewing somebody younger, someone from a different background interviewing somebody, everyone might come from a slightly different viewpoint and can see the positives and potential development areas in a candidate, and be able to share that with you, so that you're not just relying on what we like to do in recruitment is gut feel. Whether you're a hiring manager or a recruiter, we rely on that a lot, right? We do it so often, we kind of think, well, we just know what's right. But of course, what we're doing there is we're excluding potentially so much talent by already making those assumptions. So we might get it right and our gut feel might be right and that person's a perfect hire, but what have we missed along the way is the important aspect to remember there. And then of course there's plenty of technology and AI tools out there. Be careful what you choose though. Amazon a few years ago developed this very funky AI tool to filter and funnel, obviously, the very high volume of applicants into their technology, side of their business. And what they found was it actually excluded women from the process. And that was based on the AI tool learning from the previous 10 years worth of hires. It learned that most people hired were men. And so it went, oh, okay, this is preferred to have men. So it was then filtering through mostly male applicants. So it had the complete opposite effect. So yeah, be careful what you wish for in that aspect. Choose your technology wisely. There's plenty out there. I know TRC use video interviewing a lot. And that can really, there's biases in every process, but what that can do is it can help someone overcome a bias that might be on their CV. So rather than just relying on a CV, get a candidate to submit, a 60-second or 2-minute video. Maybe you have 1 or 2 questions that they can record and let their personality shine. And I know that, there's an example where somebody was out of work for a very long period of time raising a family, and was out there just over and over again trying to apply for jobs, not even getting a call back. And had been out of work for quite some time, like many years. Obviously, that assumption was not up to date with technology, not up to date with, current business or commercial aspects. And then had an opportunity to submit a video interview. And based on that video interview and her personality shining through and her skills and her intelligence and how way she articulated, got her an interview, and then through the rest of the process and ended up getting the job. So it's just another tool to be able to help facilitate getting a different aspect of somebody early in that process before we start making assumptions just based on, say, a CV. So I know, as I say, I know TRC rely on that quite a lot, and I find a lot of success from it. So lots and lots of tools out there. Research them well, and every tool won't work for every role. You need to mix it up as well and experiment a bit with that also. So just to finish off, my mouse decided not to work. Hold on. So I'm just going to come back to the teaser that Simon mentioned earlier. So a father and son are in a car crash and a rush to the hospital. The father dies. The boy is taken to the operating room and the surgeon says, I can't operate on this boy because he's my son. How is this possible? How many of you said, well, because obviously it's a woman, right? How many of you, if you're absolutely honest with yourself, that immediately thought it was a woman? And how many of you, even if it was just for a split second, thought, oh, how can that be? It's a man. If you thought it was a man, it's okay. Don't beat yourself up. It's a natural thing, as we've said throughout this whole presentation. It's built into our DNA. It's just recognizing these things, and over time we will evolve and change. So, but hopefully some of you said it was a woman. So thank you, guys. Thank you, Simon, for inviting me to this session. I hope you found it useful. Over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Teresa. Sorry to make you rush a little bit at the end there. I overran a little bit. That's awesome. All right. We promised everyone we'd be done by 8:40. I think people have got to do. But has anyone got any questions? Or I'll send out the slides and a link to the video as well. And I'll send it out to everyone. I think oh, good question, Matt. We actually did kind of prove the anchoring thing, which is people whose numbers were lower we only had 4 people really guess, but on average we did guess slightly lower. But it was built in 1631. It's finished building.
Well out,
yeah. No one got it. But all right, so I'll send out the slides and the video and the podcast link to everyone. I'll do that this week. Anyone got any other questions? It's pretty full on. All right, cool. So thanks everyone.
Simon.
There you go. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Teresa, for coming and doing that for us. That was awesome.
No worries.
So much information. And yeah, I hope everyone got something from that.
Yeah, you do that.
Thanks, guys. That was great.
Reading.
Thanks, Teresa.
Cheers, guys.
No worries.
All right, everyone. Have an awesome day.
Thanks,
See you
Simon.
around
Cheers,
soon.
guys.
Everyone.
Bye.
Tuesday.
Happy
See you
Tuesday.
later.
Bye.